Welcome to The Politics Guys, a place for bipartisan, rational, and civil debate on American politics and policy. I'm Trey Orndorff, a political scientist, currently at Daytona State College, but soon to be Oklahoma Christian University. I'm joined this week by Ken Katkin as we tackle a busy week in politics. How's your week been, Ken?
Oh, it's been pretty good. I had a vacation week, which is always nice.
Oh, I wish I could say the same thing. I'm in the midst of packing a house and packing children, which that's not as much fun.
Yeah,
So, Ken, are you ready to hit our big stories this week?
I sure am.
Well, I think what we're going to start with, listeners, this week is we're going to take a look at the conduct report on the FBI. So, on Thursday, the Justice Department Inspector General issued a report on the FBI's actions during the 2016 election. There is a lot to this report, and there is a lot of commentary on this report. And I think we're really going to try to separate those two things. So let me start by just outlining the report itself, and then we can kind of move on to the responses to it. The Inspector General argued that Comey was, quote, insubordinate, end quote. He did not follow FBI procedures when he held a July 2016 news conference about the Clinton investigation. And further, he did not follow procedure again when he told Congress about days before the election about new Clinton emails. Further, he even failed to inform the Attorney General at the time, Loretta Lynch, about his recommendations not to pursue charges. In a moment that CNN rightfully calls ironic for Clinton supporters, Comey also used his personal Gmail account for FBI business. So, in short, Comey was insubordinate. The FBI acted in a slow and inexcusable way. Several investigators showed some real bias, including some text messages between FBI agents indicating that they'll, quote, stop Trump from becoming president. But the big end of the report, though, was that there was no systematic bias in the outcome of the investigation with Hillary. So what does this mean? It kind of seems on the commentary side that for Trump, it vindicates his actions, and for Democrats, it vindicates that the Clinton case was not biased. As multiple outlets are noting, quote, everyone is claiming victory. So, Ken, what do you think about this, both its content and the response to it?
Well, I'll start with the content and my own response to it, and then maybe we can talk about other people's response to it. But I didn't think, I can't say I've made it through all 500 pages. I have I have made it through the parts that the news media has focused on the most, I think, and I think the report is a very strange report. Because, for instance, I agree with the way you characterized it, that it somewhat justifies Trump's decision to fire Comey, but I think it doesn't. It isn't clear enough about the fact that there was tremendous bias against Hillary Clinton, and I think the report shows that there was tremendous bias against Hillary Clinton. But then when it states its conclusions, it doesn't state it that way. But there's absolutely nothing in the report that indicates that Hillary Clinton ever did anything illegal or wrong. And so the whole idea that there was this investigation, that it went on, that it reopened, that Comey announced when he first announced that he was closing it, he still criticized Hillary Clinton. And later, when he reopened it, all of that is against a context where the report makes very clear that she never did anything wrong.
Mm-hmm.
And similarly, the report, somewhat in the claims of bias, which it does make and which you mentioned, they seem to be very unsubstantiated. They point out that some of the FBI officers expressed political opinions, which is it's not an improper thing to do. There's no claims anywhere that they acted in any way that was biased against Trump. Every bit of bias that's mentioned anywhere by anyone is bias against Hillary Clinton, and in terms of actions. Now, certainly there's statements and texts and emails where a couple of the agents seemed very concerned about a Trump presidency, but there's not a single claim anywhere in the report that those agents actually did anything improper to act that out. And in fact, those agents, the same agents that were so worried about a Trump presidency, the only thing they really did in terms of the Hillary Clinton investigation was try to keep moving that investigation forward. They did not ever anywhere in the report do anything that would seem to me to indicate that they tried to stop that investigation.
Yeah, I mean, and I think that you're onto something there in the sense that one of the points that Trump has made is that he loves it except for the end, right? He loves everything but the conclusion, which is that, there's no systematic bias. I think the thing that makes this particularly difficult, and I think you're teasing that out, Ken, is the fact that you have FBI agents in this case probably talking in overly glib ways, and as a result, even if it hasn't affected what has actually happened, which I think that's what's kind of the bottom line outcome from the Inspector General's report, it taints the agency in the sense that on the one hand you have agents who are making these kinds of claims that you hope that they wouldn't be talking about in this kind of way, and on the other hand you then have a head of the FBI who is taking a series of actions that are not consistent with the precedent of the FBI. And so I think that's where you kind of get this
Well,
potential rhetorical win for both sides.
yeah, but that's only because it's being spun. If you really deconstruct that, the head of the FBI is violating FBI policies in ways that are redounding entirely to the benefit of Trump, whereas the subordinates who are in private emails expressing, that they would prefer Hillary to be elected, they didn't violate any FBI policies. They didn't do a single thing wrong. They didn't abuse their authority in any way to implement their political preferences. They're entitled to have political preferences. They're entitled to have private conversations with each other about their preferences. So all of the so-called bias against Trump, it's not real. It's just people who have a political view, which is not improper. Whereas at the top, the bias against Clinton was very, very real. It led to extreme violations of longstanding policies that were improper and that actually flipped the election.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know if I'd go so far. I think it's difficult to say if that's what caused the election itself, but I think you're right that this is not a particularly good report for Comey at all, because you're absolutely right. He's the one here who's at the center of this, and he kind of tries to play it as the well, I'm damned if I do, and if I'm damned if I don't kind of situation. But really, had he simply followed
Kept,
policy,
yeah, yeah.
maybe he would have been criticized. Okay, fine. I mean, everybody can get criticized, but he would not be considered insubordinate.
Yeah, and I mean, on the issue of whether he flipped the election, the very best evidence is that he did. Nate Silver looked into that question way back at the time and did it based on the differences between the polling on people who did early voting before the date of the second Comey announcement and people who voted on election day, and you see a 6-point swing. And it's really hard to explain such a sudden, fast swing in such a short period of time, right around the Comey announcement, other than to attribute it to the Comey announcement.
I actually had seen that, and I think that was it was a good attempt at trying to piece out a variable. I will say, though, that on levels that probably are more than what we can get into here, I did take some mathematical issue with the way, as a fellow researcher, that he produced that study. That I think that he had some admitted variable bias in that, but that's probably a little, we want to get a little too statistical here.
Yeah.
But
No, to take it
yeah.
back to what's actually in the report, in the Inspector General report, I mean, the Comey never should have criticized Hillary Clinton in the July press conference where he said that they weren't going to charge her with anything.
Well, I
It
think
was
even more specifically is the one with Congress.
and then in October,
When he's not informing the Attorney General. I mean, that is just, I don't even know. But yeah.
yeah, yeah. I mean, it's the in any investigation, it's improper to be leaking about it before they bring indictments. And in political investigations, they don't even bring the indictments until after the election.
Well, and not only
So
that, in this case, he's not the one who should be deciding whether or not you're having a prosecution. That's the Justice
yeah,
Department.
right, and they didn't have a prosecution.
Hmm.
Nobody, Hillary Clinton was not indicted, and all he did is trash her again and again and again, and not indict her. So, I mean, his conduct was completely reprehensible, and it's not at all comparable to what Peter Strzok or Lisa Page did. They did nothing wrong, nothing. It's not wrong for them to talk to each other about how they don't want Trump to be elected. That might indicate, that you should look around to see if they actually did anything wrong, but they didn't, and the Inspector General's report doesn't say that they did.
No, I agree with you on that front, but as a guy who lives in a state who has we call the Sunshine Act, meaning that every email that you send can be asked for and produced, I would suggest that they were not setting themselves up for a happy outcome when you know that this is going to be such a big deal. But I agree with you, that doesn't change whether or not that what they did was wrong or biased. It probably just wasn't. It wasn't the most savvy move, I guess, is probably a better way of putting it.
Yeah, I don't have a problem with their emails with each other being released. I have more of a problem with the Inspector General concluding that the mere fact that they had political opinions means that they did their jobs improperly. I mean, you and I have political opinions, and I hope nobody says that means that we're doing our jobs improperly.
Yeah, what I'm suggesting though is that if I were to transmit those beliefs through my Daytona State email account, I can imagine that is then going to put me under a microscope in a way that I probably would rather not.
Yeah, well, I mean, people may know, that you're a conservative professor, or a libertarian professor, but that's not itself improper. And if someone was going to look at that and say, well, see, he has a political biases, so therefore he's not doing his job properly as a professor. I think you can see that would be an unfair accusation, and I think that is the only thing that was really said against Strzok and Page.
No, agreed.
Yeah, so I didn't feel that the Inspector General. I felt like he really tried to bend over backwards to say that there was sort of bias on all sides. In fact, I think he makes it out that it was maybe a form of bias when Strzok suggested that the FBI should focus more on the Trump-Russia investigation than the Hillary Clinton investigation. And that itself seemed like a strange conclusion for the Inspector General to reach, because the Hillary Clinton investigation was already over at that point. It was closed. There was no reason to think that there'd be anything on the Wiener laptop that was any different than what they'd seen before. And in fact, it wasn't. The material on the Wiener laptop turned out to be entirely consisting of emails they'd already seen before. And based on everything they'd seen before, they'd already closed the case and found there were no charges to bring. Meanwhile, the Trump-Russia stuff was a continuing, ongoing crime in progress that they needed to be investigating at the time. Of course, they should be prioritizing that higher than reopening a closed investigation based on basically no new evidence. And the Inspector General tried to make it out that there was some kind of bias involved when Strzok suggested that it's more important to investigate an ongoing criminal conspiracy against the United States that hasn't been investigated yet than to reopen a closed investigation based on no new evidence of something that would have been relatively trivial anyhow.
Yeah, I mean, I think on the facts, I think you're accurate in many ways. I don't think that's the takeaway that most people are going to come away with it, though.
No, Trump is spinning it hard that this somehow exonerates him, and I think the report is a little too trying to be even-handed based on, if you really read the things that if you read the facts that it finds and didn't read its conclusions and just read the facts that it finds, I think the only conclusion I could take from it is that all those facts indicate that there was tremendous bias against Hillary Clinton in the FBI.
Yeah, but the rhetorical situation is such is that you have a rebuke to Comey, and as a result, that seemingly vindicates the position of Donald Trump, and not the position of those who had for a while idolized Comey. And I think that's where the mileage is going to come from.
But the rebuke to Comey is that he treated Hillary Clinton unfairly and threw the election to Trump.
Yeah,
that's what he did.
Ironic, and yet I think that's where the rhetorical win is. So I mean, I agree with your analysis.
Well, and I have no sympathy for Comey at all. I'm glad he was fired. I'm glad he was fired for the very reasons that the Rosenstein memo said that he was fired. It just so happens that Trump told Lester Holt on national television
that's not what he was doing.
That's not what he was fired.
Listen, this is what I said I was going to do, and that's one of the cases where It's hard sometimes to tell where Donald Trump, the brilliant social media strategist, because I think in some ways he is, and the bumbler, end and begin. But and I think that's kind of a good movement there, that conversation to talk about another kind of Donald Trump moment, because on June 12th this week, President Donald Trump met with Kim Jong-Un in Singapore after a volley of rhetoric concerning the meeting. So we've talked about this leading up to it. So what have we learned about the North Korean meeting, if anything? So what's new? Well, there's a few things I think are new, Ken, and then I'm curious about what you
Sure.
think. One, obviously, unlike I think most of us on this show, most Americans have thought that this meeting was a good thing. 63% of Americans thought it was a good idea, and that includes half of Democrats. Only 20% have argued it's bad if you take a look at CNN polling. The ultimate statement, as we have all mentioned, was going to be the outcome, and as the New York Times has put it, quote, contains polite platitudes, end quote. In other words, it's largely empty. There's not a whole lot there other than the symbolic nature of both sides agreeing to basically one big thing. So the big takeaway is Trump is going to suspend joint military exercises with South Korea, and North Korea says they're going to freeze weapon tests. Uh, Obviously, there's some fallout from this because clearly Trump, in his own way, decided to not inform South Korea about this possibility beforehand for the freeze for the military. And we now have kind of this lingering analyst question concerning how much clout does Kim Jong-un get out of this, and how much standing in the world does that give him? Trump seems to argue that it's give Kim some additional standing, and he's kind of joked, or he says he's joked, that he likes the way that people sit up and listen when Kim Jong-un people when he talks. But what's that kind of ultimate symbolic outcome? I think is kind of that last question. So what do you think, Ken?
Yeah, well, I mean, it's interesting. So on the politics of it, I guess I would put myself in that majority that you mentioned that thinks it would be a good thing if America and North Korea had serious talks about disarmament or even just about a thaw in hostilities. So when people hear that that's what's going on and they think that's a good thing, yeah, I think that's a good thing too. On the other hand, I don't think Trump at all has even the understanding of what the U.S.'s goals there are or should be. Nor does he have much interest, I don't think, in doing anything other than just having these photo ops. It doesn't seem to me he got anything out of North Korea, and he did give away, I think, some other concessions, not only the stopping the military exercises, but just generally trying to rehabilitate North Korea in terms of its legitimacy without asking it to do anything in return. So
Basically giving it a stage.
yeah, yeah. So I don't see that anything good actually came of it. Although I agree that it was a good opportunity. So the polling numbers that you're looking at, I'm not sure exactly when those polls were taken, but I think the idea of the talks, I think was a good
Thursday
idea.
night.
Yeah, Thursday night. So that was after. So that was after the talks. Yeah, I don't know. I don't see that it turned out in retrospect to have been a valuable exercise, but I think there was the potential last week that it could have been a valuable exercise.
Yeah, I think what Trump gets out of this is obviously he gets the rhetoric of a win, a seeming win, and I agree with you. And I think we're going to have similar political, ideological positions on the idea that countries coming together and talking, even if you don't have any major substantive outcome, is in general a positive, a good thing. What is worrisome in the case of course, kind of the counterpoint for North Korea is that you give a dictator a stage, you give him an opportunity to kind of position himself. As a matter of fact, it appeared this morning that there is a giant now propaganda video, a 45-minute propaganda video. Did anybody actually watch that whole thing? With Kim Jong-un's, what he did on the world stage with Trump, and that's being released in North Korea and other places right now as we speak. And it's difficult to weigh, well, how much is the talking worth the photo op? And in that, I don't have a really good, clear, easy answer for that one. If I did, I'd run for office. But
Yeah, I mean, I would also say that I think if you bring the what happened last weekend at the G7 into this, where Trump first tries to create a lot of tensions and hostilities with our actual allies, and then immediately goes and tries to tilt towards North Korea. Um, I look at that in a context of I think it's more evidence of Trump Russia. I mean, here he is carrying out Russia's foreign policy objectives in both places. And that's a little bit troubling to me, I would say. Breaking up the Western alliance and separating North Korea a little bit from China, so it will tilt possibly a little bit more towards Russia. It seems to me, every time Trump steps out on the world stage, it's with a Russia first foreign policy, and I think he did that in both places this week.
I think if I had to kind of analyze Trump on this particular one, it seems to me he is a trade isolationist who wants a military win. So I think what he's hoping for is the America First on trade theory, which we'll talk about a little bit more when we talk
Yeah.
about the China tariffs, and then I think on the kind of the non so international relations when you're talking about non-trade issues, he clearly wants to be the talk the he wants that kind of win. He wants to be blustery on trade policy. That's his thing, and I'm not even sure if he quite understands what it means when you're not talking about trade. I mean, this is the guy who's, while he's in North Korea, saying, "Well, look at your beautiful shores. We could put a hotel up." I think that's the side that he's thinking about.
Yeah, I mean that could be right, but it's hard to think of anything he's ever done on the international stage where you could say, well, that's not what Putin would want him to do, right? Everything seems to come back to, well, maybe he's not doing it because of Putin telling him to, but if Putin would tell him what to do, this is what Putin would tell him to do. And I think stirring up, tensions for really no reasons, starting trade wars with our traditional allies over basically phony issues, and then going right to North Korea, which has been a Chinese client state basically, and trying to peel them a little bit off of China, which I think would only mean that they would tilt towards Russia. I just can't really put that in another context. Now, I don't think he did anything in North Korea. I don't think these talks produced anything. I don't think they'll come to anything. And I'm certainly open to your idea that it's just about the photo op more than anything else, just about the political posturing. But I don't think it's inconsistent with a theory that he's just the tip of Putin's spear. I think it could look it's consistent with either hypothesis, I think.
Well, I mean, it's a difficult negative to prove, and I think we'll have to. Well, here in a minute, I think we need to talk a little bit more about that because I think this week we've had this big kind of China and tariff issue.
Yeah.
But before we get into that, we need to thank. We have two new Patreon supporters this weekend,
Oh,
Jennifer and Libby. Yeah, so thank you, Jennifer and Libby, for helping us out. We appreciate that. Um, this week, Chris, who recently sent us a contribution through PayPal, wrote, and this is really sweet, quote, "It is so refreshing to hear you guys after listening to other podcasts. I've been considering this thought. Political ideology is good until it intentionally withholds compassion from any person, group, or thought pattern. That is where evil starts being bred." And so he goes on to thank us that we express compassion for everyone. And to that end, he wants to help support us and remember our podcast. And he is going to become a regular Patreon supporter. And he thanks us for the great work we're doing. Steve, who also made a very generous monthly continuing pledge, emailed to say that he's a past district officer in Toastmasters, and he really admires our show and thanks us for encouraging people to find common ground. And so we just want to really say thank you to Chris and to Steve and to Jennifer and to Libby and everyone, because when you become a supporter of the Politics Guy, you don't just get the good feeling that comes with supporting thoughtful, bipartisan, and civil discussion. You also get access to our supporters only show. And so just so everybody knows, last week, Mike and Jay were talking about some weird Philadelphia Eagles Super Bowl celebration things in the White House. And Mike talked about how he wouldn't shake Donald Trump's hand and some other things. But I won't tell you about all of them because what we're going to ask you to do is to please join Jennifer, Libby, Chris, Steve, and all of our other great Politic Guys supporters by going to politicsguys.com/support. That's the direct link. Or you can just go to politicsguys.com and then click on the support link. And if you do that, you will then this week get a bonus show from myself and from Ken. And so we want to thank our supporters and suggest that you do that so that you don't miss out on this week's supporter show. So thank you to all of you. As we move forward, though, we want to talk a little bit more. Maybe we can, bring another bias. We're going to come to my hometown and Ken's current hometown, Ohio and Cincinnati, because this week the Supreme Court, in a 5-4 opinion, upheld Ohio's efforts to purge voter rolls and minimize election fraud, theoretically. Excuse me. As the New York Times rightfully noted, the opinion seeks to understand some dueling visions of voting in a democracy. So what happened? Well, Mr. Harmon, he sat out the 2010 midterm election, the 2012 presidential election, and the 2014 midterm election. Then he tried to vote in 2015. He wanted to vote against legalizing marijuana, and he found his name was not on the voter rolls anymore. State officials informed him that they had sent him notice in 2011, and he had failed to respond, and as a result of that failure to respond, he'd been removed from the voter rolls. Ohio actually has one of the more strict voter purge rules in the country. So after missing a single federal election, the state sends you a notice. If you don't respond to that notice, you're off the rolls. Harmon argued this violated the National Voter Registration Act of 1993 because it made failure to vote a trigger. The U.S. Sixth Circuit Court of Appeals in my hometown in yours, Ken, Cincinnati, agreed. The Supreme Court reversed that ruling, and it argued that federal law said you simply cannot purge someone for not voting. But in Ohio, the purge is the result of the letter, not the not voting, and therefore the failure to respond to the notice after not voting is in fact consistent with the National Voter Registration Act. Breyer, writing for the dissent, argued the accuracy of voting rolls is not as important as, that the accuracy of voting rolls does not justify erecting obstacles to preventing eligible voters from casting ballots. So, what do you think about this, Ken? I mean, this is your area.
Yeah. Well, it is. It's sort of. My main area is constitutional law, and this is a statutory case, but it is somewhat my area. In Ohio is where I live.
Right. Exactly.
Yes. Yeah. I think it's a bad decision. Both on the law and on the policy. I think the statute which you mentioned, most people know that statute as by its informal name, the Motor Voter Act. Motor voter, which is what put the voting registration into the when you get a driver's license. This was one of the provisions of it in 1993, and it says people can't be thrown off the rolls for not voting. Now, I think you explained it perfectly that the Supreme Court applied this very, I would say, tendentious argument where they said, well, when they throw people off the rolls for not responding to a letter that they get because they didn't vote, then that's not throwing them off for not voting. I don't agree with that. I mean, the letter is only generated because they didn't vote. That letter's not sent to people who did vote. And so it's not like everybody has to respond to a letter in order to stay on the voter rolls. It's only people that missed an election. They do have to miss more than one election. I think you said one, but it's one presidential election. But they have to miss the midterms on either side of it as well. So in Ohio, if they miss a midterm, then a presidential election, then a midterm, they'll be thrown off the rolls if they haven't responded to a letter by then.
Oh, I misunderstood that then. I apologize. My apologies.
Yeah. So it's not quite as tight as you explained it, but it's still pretty tight. That's still the shortest timeline in any state in the country for throwing people off. And really, there's no reason for it. If people vote in other states or register in other states because they've moved, or even move within the state and re-register at a different address, then the place where they register elsewhere will automatically notify. It goes into a national database. So people who register in one place don't stay on the rolls someplace else. So it's not like people could be voting in two places. I guess they say there's some concern about if people have died or something. But really, you could even in Ohio we have provisional ballots. Rather than throwing them off the rolls, which actually makes them ineligible to vote, so that their vote will not be counted. Another way it could be done if there was some concern about, we don't know that this is still the same person voting. Just like what happens when people move without changing their address with the Board of Elections. they could be allowed to cast a provisional ballot, and that could be looked into afterwards, and their vote could be counted if it turns out that there's no irregularity. That provisional ballot is used for a lot of other kinds of voting problems, primarily people who move locally. So it's there's the only real reason I think for wanting to throw people off these rolls is voter suppression, and that's exactly why the 1993 Motor Voter Act says that you can't throw people off the rolls just for not voting, because that's a form of voter suppression.
So, yeah, I mean, I am not as sympathetic to this point of view, but I'm going to take it because I think it's worth kind of articulating it out. Because I think there really are kind of two competing views of voting. And one says is that voting should be easy, everyone should have immediate access to it. And that is what I think Justice Breyer was outlining kind of eloquently in his dissent for those who go on and read the opinions. As a matter of fact, I'll post the opinions to the website. But there is a competing view that says, look, what you really want to ensure is fairness, and you ensure fairness by making sure that you minimize any kind of form of even potential fraud. And so having the requirements for having IDs and having the requirements that you vote consistently, that this is not suppression, but it's rather orderly democracy. So to that kind of point, what would you say, Ken?
Well, I'd say really it's a question of the numbers and the evidence, right? So the kinds of rules like this rule in Ohio, if it had actually been in effect in the 2016 election, because the Secretary of State tried to put it in effect then, but the Sixth Circuit Court stopped him. So 5,100 voters in Ohio that actually did vote, and all of whom were legal eligible voters, 5,100 of them would not have been allowed to vote. Now, if you want to put that against, how many cases are there in Ohio where it's been documented that dead people voted or people voted twice or ineligible voters voted, you could count those cases on your fingers. So it's really you're suppressing 5,100 legitimate votes against the threat of one or two fraudulent votes. I don't see that that's I don't see that the weight of those two concerns is very equal.
Yeah, and again, I mean, I'm going to try to play the devil's advocate on this side. I think historically, you're going to have people point to elections in the past where you had certain cities that used potentially lax voter laws. We're looking at you, Chicago, to to attempt to basically circumvent democratic practices. And so, why wouldn't you want to basically have a firewall against that in the future?
Well, we don't have those kind of problems anymore, and particularly in Ohio. I mean, in Ohio, not only do we have to have two or three judges from each political party in every single polling place, and for people who vote by mail or whatever, you have those similar numbers in the Board of Elections where the envelopes are opened. But we have the optical scanning that's used by the voting machines. We keep that, and we keep the paper record. They can be reconciled against each other. So in Ohio, you fill out bubbles on a piece of paper, and you feed that piece of paper into a computer that counts what bubbles you filled out. And then at the end of the day, all of the pieces of paper that people cast are still inside that voting machine, so that if there has to be a recount, they can be compared against the tallies that the machine got. Every single person who checks in to vote, they're checked out by a couple of Democrats and a couple of Republicans who are working at the polls. And when the machine tallies are counted out at the end, the Democrat and Republican poll judges together watch the tallies come out and have to hand sign that everything was on the up and up before those numbers are delivered to the Board of Elections. So I think the sort of fear of the boogeyman of vote fraud is, maybe based on practices that happened a long time ago that there's a lot of safeguards against now. There's basically no evidence that anything like that goes on now. And it's absolutely certain that these kind of restrictions stop large numbers of eligible voters from voting. And again, the number that we know for Ohio for 2016 is 5,100. There's 5,100 people who had been purged by Secretary Husted from the rolls for not voting, who were in fact eligible. who were able to vote in 2016 because of the Sixth Circuit Court decision, which has just been reversed. So, 5,100 is a lot.
Mm-hmm. Well, and just to be clear, because I know that social media will blow up if I'm not clear about this. I think on this one, Ken and I are maybe unfortunately very closely aligned. I agree with what you're saying, Ken. But I do want to kind of present that kind of other view, maybe the kind of more the Jay view if he was here to kind of let us, kind of hear what that might be. But, I deeply agree with you. I think in visions of democracy that one ought to err on the side of the vote. And you rightfully point out that we, as a result of historic practices at the local level, have lots of fail safes, and that additional purges would net minimal, if any, gains. But.
Yeah, and I do want to reemphasize also the provisional ballot mechanism that in Ohio for other kinds of voting issues, you often have people who move locally and they haven't notified the Board of Elections about their address change. And so they when they show up to vote, they may be not in the precinct that they should be in. For those kind of things, we use a provisional ballot mechanism where they can cast a vote. It gets sealed into an envelope. It doesn't get counted until 10 days later after there's time to check up on their bona fides. If their bona fides don't check out, it's never counted. There's absolutely no reason that mechanism couldn't be similarly used in the situation where someone's missed a few elections and not responded to a postcard.
Yeah. I mean, and again, that's easy to miss anyway. It's very easy to miss those kinds of things. But on something that we might have some more disagreement, Ken, maybe. We're going to find out. Okay. I'm curious about this. So last week on the show, we had a lot of discussion about the G7 meeting. We've talked about it a little bit more. But what has happened this week is that Donald Trump has followed through with threats to crack down on China for unfair trade practices. He imposed a 25% tariff on $50 billion worth of Chinese imports on Friday. China responded swiftly later on Friday, focusing on $50 billion worth of American goods, including beef, poultry, tobacco, and cars. It appears that Mr. Trump is ready early next week to impose further tariffs in responses to China's response, and China is, as a result, likely to back away from a $70 billion agreement to buy American agricultural and energy products. So these tariffs are, in fact, in line with Trump's campaign promises. One of his biggest promises was to crack down on trade practices that he says cost Americans jobs. As a matter of fact, on Friday, Trump argued that the relationship with China had been, quote, very unfair for a very long time, end quote, and further that, quote, tariffs are essential to prevent further unfair transfers of American technology and intellectual property to China, which will protect American jobs, end quote. So what do you think about this kind of economic policy? We had started to hint a little bit earlier about what happened in the G7, and obviously this week, the big story being with China, which has been kind of the on-again, off-again question.
Yeah, well, I look at the China tariff issue differently than I look at the issue where he's threatening tariffs against Canada and Europe, and I find those to be no-brainers. That's completely the wrong thing to do, to put tariffs against Canada, Europe. With China, in principle, it could be good for the U.S. to put tariffs against China because China has low-wage jobs that move there from America because they're low wage, and if these were tariffs that were targeted to make it more expensive to offshore what could be good American jobs to China, from economic policy, I could see some justification for that. I'm not sure that these are all that well targeted. I don't even know what he's talking about when he says that this could affect intellectual property violations and things like that. I'm not sure how tariffs could do that. But I have to kind of reserve judgment. I think in principle, and this may be where you're going, that as someone who's a bit from the left, I'm a little bit more open to tariffs against low-wage countries. I'm basically a free trader like you are, though, and I'm totally opposed to tariffs against high-wage countries. I think we should be in free trade with high-wage countries, but countries like China, it's complicated. I'd be interested to hear your thoughts on it.
Well, I know we had a lot of things where we were going to agree, so it's always great we can kind of end on something. Because as listeners know, one of the things that I had argued about way back during the election is that when you have a campaign that in some ways I think was dominated by the rhetoric of Trump and Sanders, that really free trade came under attack because both Trump and Sanders, as a matter of fact, this morning, just to remind myself, like, we're, 'cause sometimes you think about things differently.
Great.
Sanders continues to argues that he's, quote, against most free trade agreements, including NAFTA and with
Yeah.
China and with Canada,
Right.
which is interesting. And he actually argued that we need to pull out of all of those agreements. And one of the ones he hits is the one that actually Trump is hitting, which is the permanent normal trade relations with China. Now, from my point of view, one of the things that has put me in the Republican camp, Ken, has been a commitment to free trade. So, as listeners probably know, right, I'm a libertarian-leaning Republican, a libertarian kind of Republican, and so to see both parties now take this protectionist tract is very disappointing to me, and I don't see there being that big of a difference between what he's doing with the G7 and China. I mean, he is sadly, in my opinion, being consistent, right? So if these kinds of trade practices are bad, then he's across the board trying to limit them. And I think this is what we set ourselves up for in 2016 when two of our major, it really fell to Hillary Clinton to be the one person I remember when she was debating Bernie Sanders to basically say, wait a second, free trade is what's gotten us where we are, which is a fascinating point of view. You don't generally think of that as coming from the mainstream Democratic candidate.
Well, it is different free trade with Canada and Europe versus free trade with China, because Canada and Europe are high wage countries, right? So competing with them doesn't cause American jobs to go to those countries for the purpose of paying lower wages than here. Trade with China does do that. So I think it is different. I basically think the only argument, because like you, I sort of default to a presumption in favor of free trade. But I think, to me, the only argument for why you would ever rebut that presumption would be, well, if free trade with very low wage countries could cause American employers to offshore jobs to those low wage countries solely for the purpose of paying very low wages, and then we lose those jobs. So I see that as a circumstance that's unique to the low wage countries and not applicable to Canada or Europe. And so I wouldn't see any reason to depart from ordinary free trade principles with respect to Canada and Europe.
On that particular issue, though, but for countries to have rising wages, you have to have a competition of things being produced in that country. And so as companies begin to flee, potentially, in that kind of view, to another country, that will lead to rising wages in the other country. As a matter of fact, I would point to some of the things that have happened with India. I mean, it wasn't that long ago that the thought, that this job suck was going to be India. But then what eventually happens is that wages in India, for many, especially in urban areas where there had been people going overseas, increased. It increased to the point where it no longer made sense to try to do that. And so, while I agree that you can have short-term imbalances with low-wage countries, that the market itself corrects that function, and that's actually what both brings increased discourse between countries because you have increased amounts of trade, but it also raises the level of living and the wages for the low-wage country in question eventually.
Yeah, I don't know about that with big countries like China or India, actually. I think there's so many people in China and so many people in India also who aren't even in the modern economy that, there's an enormous capacity to just offer low wage jobs and get people to take them in those countries. You'd have to have all the people who aren't even participating in the economy start participating in the economy before it would be before you'd have the kind of upward pressure on wages that you're talking about, I think.
Well, I mean, while that is in fact true, your ultimate argument there is that there's somehow some kind of max number of human population where there can be high-paying jobs. So while you're right that those markets have not been labor tapped yet, That doesn't mean that all of those potential workers are actually true potential workers, even in low areas. Otherwise, China wouldn't be still attempting to industrialize those areas, right? So to say that there's more workers who would still work, well, that's true, but that doesn't mean they're prepared to do the kinds of jobs that would be offshored. And even if you did eventually, assuming, I mean, again, we today have how much larger of a population, and yet we still have seen in most countries rising wages. So to say that just because you have an additional amount of population doesn't necessarily mean that you have to see a forever future of low wages.
Well, we haven't had rising wages here. It's probably been 35 years. Other than in the top 5 or 10% of the income spectrum, there've been rising wages in real dollars in America. They've been pretty stagnant for a long time now for the bottom 90%. I just don't know. I'm not gonna. I feel kind of cross purposes here, as I guess you do to some extent, because really I have to think that the more you talk about this at a sort of general level, the more I have to agree with you that free trade is the best policy generally. I do think that sometimes you want to look at this at a more specific level and say, well, what's the effect? When we fill up our Walmarts with products that are made in China, of course, consumers get the benefit that the stuff at Walmart is cheap and people like that. But
well, and they can then spend those dollars other places as well, of course. Continue.
Yeah, but all those products that are actually in Walmart that are made in China, 35, 40 years ago, those products would have been made in America by Americans getting paid much better wages than what the Chinese people who are making them now are getting paid. So, there is a loss there. And in a world of increasing digitization and mechanization, there's not going to be as much need for workers to make things as there used to be. We've got an increasing world population. At the same time, we've got incredibly increasing productivity because of technology. And so, what are all these people going to do for a living? And so at a certain point, if you could have, universal free trade and the lowest wage taker would do every job, it seems like in many sectors, the wages could go pretty much approaching zero.
And that's an interesting argument, and we won't have time to completely piece it out. But it's fascinating to me because I think sometimes we have to be a little cautious, or at least maybe a little humble about thinking about the future. Because while I agree with what you're saying about the production of the physical manifestation of stuff, it's difficult to say what it'll be that we'll be producing and creating in the future. So, for instance, at one point in time, you might have said, well, what are we going to do when we don't have, horse and buggy makers anymore? But of course, we were around the corner from things like airplanes and different kinds of trains and automobiles. And so in the digital world, in the same way, I'm not sure what will be the digital things that we produce. I mean, today, who would have thought of the billions of dollars that we do in production of code? And it's difficult to say what will be the code of the future. And that's a kind of a production. It's just one that maybe many of us had not considered as a possibility because it's a round technological bend. And that's, I think, one of the things that when you're talking about that kind of default position to free trade, that you have faith in the idea that that humans will continue to produce new and interesting things even when we ourselves personally cannot fathom what that would be.
Yeah, of course you're right about that. But the one caveat I'd put there is that the kinds of future production that you're talking about, including software code, which you mentioned, or the things we can't fathom yet, it's increasingly going to be the higher and higher educated people who can produce that stuff, and it's going to take smaller numbers of them to do it. So, I mean, Google or Facebook today are worth probably more in real dollars than General Motors was ever worth. But they're not employing the numbers of people at the wage levels that companies like General Motors were producing. And if you've got machines, so capable now of providing for our material needs, then it seems like the kinds of sectors that are going to be able to employ very large numbers of people who are not highly educated and pay them decent wages, It's just hard for me to see how that comes back. I mean, I can see how there could be, who would have imagined Facebook or Google, and now they're worth billions and billions, and there'll be future things like that. But remember that Facebook and Google are not employing super large numbers of people relative to manufacturing industries, and that the people they are employing are much higher educated than the average person.
I would say that, for instance, like if you look at, say, an Apple, that you probably can't just, although it'd be an interesting study, as you suggest, to maybe compare, the real dollar comparison from, say, an Apple or a Google to a General Motors. But you also have to include in that number. So without an Apple, you don't have what is it now, the $1 trillion worth of companies that produce applications for Apple products. So in one way, you might have to include those into the Apple when you consider the comparison between, say, a General Motors and an Apple. But that'd be a fascinating study. As you were saying that, I'm thinking, I wonder how we could set this up,
Yeah.
and try to make that happen. But I think that we've actually gone a little bit long this morning, Ken. So I think we'll need to stop here. And it's been wonderful talking with you. And if you'd like to hear more from me and Ken, we're not done yet. In just a few minutes, we're going to be recording the Politics Guys Supporters exclusive show, where we're going to be talking about some fascinating things, including my running in technology. So we're going to see what you guys think about, what you put in your ears. Interesting, we talk about Apple. So that's all I'll say about that for now. That is it. Thanks, and I hope that you like what you heard. Listeners, you can head to politicsguys.com/support or head to politicsguys.com and click on support. And there you can also subscribe. I'm going to ask if you will share this episode with one friend. If you can rate this podcast on iTunes or on Spotify, that would be amazing, and it helps us. And if you go and support us now, you will be able to download the Politics Guys Supporter exclusive show. As always, if you want to reach out to us, you can always hit us up at mail@politicsguys.com. You can hit us up on Facebook at facebook.com/politicsguys, or as always on Twitter at Politics Guys. The executive producers of the Politics Guys are Michael Baranowski, Jerry Carson, Trey Orndorff, and Bruce Johnson. This episode was produced by Trey Orndorff. We'll have a new show on Monday. We hope to see you then.